It's Thursday. It's thoughts. It's Thursday thoughts. And today we have another form that we're going to be dealing with. This is a new form that the Utah Association of Realtors put together. It's currently on the MLS. I'm currently getting it programmed in Total Brokerage, so it should be ready here in the next day or two. But something that I've done is with the increasing frequency of short-term leasebacks after sellers sell their home, but they need to stay in the home for a certain amount of time before they can buy their next home. The short-term lease agreement that we had started to have some problems, because we've created these weird holdover tenancies and there's way more of them. And the more you have these sorts of things, the more the problems with them become evident. And so there's a lot of changes they made to this. First of all, this form is no longer a separate standalone agreement. So the short-term leaseback agreement is now an addendum to the purchase contract. And this is for a lot of reasons. Primarily, it has to do with how the property's condition has been when it's been delivered after a short-term leaseback agreement. And so the new agreement is 3 pages long. And I just kind of want to go over a few of the main points that are different about this. I mean, again, the first biggest one is if you're going to use this, it is now an addendum to the purchase contract. And what that has done is made it so that with the lease agreement that the seller who's staying in the property is still agreeing to deliver the property in the same condition it was in as per paragraph 10.3 when you went under contract. Okay, and that's a lot of the things here have to do with that. Like the seller's not going to make changes to the property. They're not going to damage the property and not pay for it. It really makes them liable as a seller in a similar way that the previous contract did, as opposed to as a tenant who just has their security deposit to lose. And so that goes over in paragraph 1, just kind of goes over that. Paragraph 2 goes over the term of the lease. Now, as with the last one, the entire lease payment for the entire term of the lease is due at closing, but this lets you know how that's going to be collected. Whether you are getting it in the form of a check or a wire transfer or cash, or whatever it might be, that is now laid out here as how the seller is going to give the buyer, who's now the owner, the lease payment. Now, something else they did here, which was pretty fantastic, is they allowed for a proration of rent. So let's say you have a 60-day lease agreement and your sellers are there, but they find a house and they only need it for 45 days. What this now does is allow a proration of rent to where the buyer, the new owner, would have to return a portion of the rent if the lease agreement is ended prematurely. It also offers the option to have that not be an option. That really comes in handy because we've been defaulting to this 59 or 60-day rule because of how lenders want occupancy to work. But sometimes you only need the property for 32, 33 days. So this kind of allows your sellers a little bit of leeway in terms of what they're paying in rent or what they're going to get back in rent if they don't stay in the home for the entire tenancy. It also goes over, finally, who's going to be responsible for what utilities. The previous agreement basically just had the seller still responsible, the buyer responsible for all sorts of utilities, and that the utilities were just included in rent from the seller. That was no longer the case, and it doesn't make sense, especially if you're going into a 2-month lease. So that's something to keep in mind. It still allows for a security deposit, and it now also allows for clearer right of entry for the buyer. So the buyer, being the new owner, is a landlord and has the same rights as a landlord. So the right to access the property, to assess condition of the property, to assess the tenancy, all of those sorts of things are rights a landlord has, and this lease allows for that as well. So it also handles like a default of the leaseback, which is basically defining how somebody who's staying in a short-term lease agreement could default on the lease, and then what the ramifications are. And really it's just basic Utah law for landlords and tenants. Another one it handles is, like, let's say they go longer, they don't move out. There's a penalty for what's called a holdover tenancy, and it adds a per day cost if the seller stays longer than the agreed upon term. So say you do a 30-day lease agreement, you end up needing 38 days. It's accounted for here. And outside of that, it goes back over liability. Who needs to have what insurance? The buyer's property insurance will be covering the structure, but the seller will be required to have what's called renter's insurance to cover their personal property, because the buyer, the new owner, is no longer liable for the seller's personal property. So worst case scenario, your seller stays in a short-term lease agreement and the house burns down. They need to have separate insurance for their property because the buyer's homeowner's insurance, their hazard insurance, will not cover the seller's property. That's something to make sure your sellers know about. If you're doing this, they need to secure renter's insurance. And it's like $30 a month. Like, it is a very, very cheap thing to carry. And then the last thing that this does is it actually releases us from an agency agreement for this lease. So we as agents are not representing the sellers on this lease as soon as it goes into effect at closing. Therefore, our liability in terms of what goes on inside of the lease is limited and mitigated. And this is a lot better than the last form. You guys, actually, the forms committee has been doing what I feel like is a really good job on some of these new forms, because it's addressing a lot of issues that we could see and creating some flexibility to address those issues. This agreement is way better than the last one we've been using. It's much clearer and everything is spelled out a lot better. So like I said, this should be up in total brokerage by tomorrow at the latest. And I would really encourage you guys to use it, because it is a vast improvement over the previous agreement. And it also holds both parties to a higher standard. And that's really what we're after all the time, really, in this industry. And so really appreciate all of you. Love you all. Man, I'm ending this thing weird, but whatever. That's what I got. We'll see you next week.